Some questions are too heavy for the tongue and too sacred for silence. Good evening, and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. In tonight's figures story, we journey through the life of a man whose brilliance once ruled the scholars of his age, until his heart rebelled against his mind. In today's story, we explore the life of Imam Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, the mind that found the heart. He was celebrated as proof of Islam, a genius who silenced skeptics and dazzled empires. But beneath the robes of certainty hid a soul, trembling before an invisible question. What if all this knowledge means nothing? If my heart is not alive? The year was 1058 CE in the city of Tus, near the rolling plains of Khorasan. War had carved its scars on the land, but within a modest house, a candle burned through the night. Beside it, a boy with large, curious eyes watched his father copy manuscripts for a living. The father's hands trembled, not from age, but from reverence. He told his sons, "Knowledge is a trust. Guard it as you would guard your prayer." That boy was Muhammad ibn Muhammad Al-Ghazali. His father died early, leaving him and his younger brother Ahmad in the care of a local Sufi friend. The man was poor but devout, feeding them bread soaked in wisdom rather than butter. From those nights of hunger, Al-Ghazali learned that truth was not found in plenty, but in patience. Years later, he would remember, "I tasted poverty young. Perhaps God meant for my soul to lean on nothing else." At 15, he walked barefoot to Jurgen, carrying nothing but parchment and a longing heart. There he studied under Imam al-Ismaili, devouring logic, jurisprudence, and debate. His memory was said to be miraculous. Pages glanced once, stayed forever. But even then, a restlessness stirred. He memorized arguments faster than meaning could settle. When a sandstorm stranded him on his return to Tus, bandits attacked the caravan. They seized his satchel filled with notes. Desperate, he chased after their chief, pleading, "Take all else, but return my knowledge." The man laughed. "If your knowledge sits in a bag, then you have none." Al-Ghazali froze. Those words pierced deeper than any blade. He realized his learning was fragile, owned, not internalized. That moment, beneath a bruised sky, he vowed, "I will not rest until knowledge becomes my being, not my baggage." He didn't know it yet, but God had just planted the first crack in his foundation of pride. By his 20s, Al-Ghazali reached Nishapur, the intellectual capital of the Seljuk Empire. Under the legendary Imam al-Juwayni, he refined logic until arguments became art. Peers whispered of his brilliance, how he could predict questions before they were asked, how his pen bled gold onto parchment. When al-Juwayni passed away, the students scattered like stars after dawn. But Al-Ghazali's light only grew brighter. He was summoned to Baghdad, to the majestic Nizamiya College, at the invitation of the Vizier Nizam al-Mulk. At barely 33, he became the most powerful scholar in Islam. Every morning, crowds filled the halls, judges, poets, merchants, hungry for the clarity of his words. He debated philosophers, dismantled heresies, and dazzled rulers. He had what every man desired: fame, wealth, mastery, and followers who hung on every syllable. But at night, as candles died and silence filled the madrasa, his heart whispered the question he could not silence. Why do they love my words when I no longer feel them? In the 5th year of his fame, something shifted. His voice began to tremble during lectures. His breath caught mid-sentence. Physicians called it a nervous condition. He called it God's mercy. He would later write, poetically paraphrased here, "God loosened my tongue from the world so that my heart might learn to speak to him." He stopped eating. His nights were sleepless. He felt the walls of reason closing in. The mind that had mastered logic now stood helpless before its own confusion. Students came to visit. He dismissed them gently, saying only, "Pray for me. The tongue that once led others has forgotten its road." One dawn in 1095 CE, Al-Ghazali packed a small bundle, ink, quill, and silence. He told no one. He left Baghdad pretending to go on pilgrimage, but in truth, he was walking away from himself. As the city gates closed behind him, he felt a strange freedom, like a bird remembering its wings after years in a cage. He did not know where he was headed, only that he must find the God he had spoken of but never truly met. He turned toward Damascus, and as the sun broke over the horizon, he whispered a prayer that trembled like a confession. "O Lord, if all my learning was a veil between us, then let ignorance be my teacher." He didn't know then, but what awaited him would strip him bare of glory, comfort, and pride, until nothing remained but a heart illuminated by truth. Because sometimes God must empty a man of everything he thinks he is, before filling him with who he was meant to be. But what would he find in that emptiness? And would he ever return to the world he left behind? He arrived in Damascus cloaked not in fame, but in anonymity. The city, alive with traders and scholars, barely noticed the quiet stranger slipping into its heart. In a narrow lane stood the Umayyad Mosque, its courtyard bathed in morning light, its echo carrying the prayers of men too weary to speak their sins aloud. He entered quietly, knelt among them, and felt something break open within him. For years he had spoken about God. Now, for the first time, he spoke to him. He rented a small cell in the mosque's upper chambers. No students, no servants, no applause. Just ink, parchment, and silence. He prayed, fasted, and wept. For 6 months he lived like a shadow between dawn and dusk, cleaning his soul from the dust of argument. He later described it, paraphrased, as a retreat where reason bowed to revelation and the heart began to breathe again. At first, his mind resisted. Thoughts raced like restless horses. "What are you doing, Abu Hamid? You left the world of honor for the world of obscurity." But the stillness of Damascus was a mirror too honest to avoid. He looked at himself, not as the world's greatest theologian, but as a servant who had forgotten his master. And he realized a truth that frightened him. He had been worshiping knowledge itself. He had mistaken the light of learning for the light of God. Some nights he walked through the silent courtyard and stared at the stars. Their calm mocked his inner storm. He whispered, "I knew of you, my Lord, but I did not know you. Forgive me for teaching what I had not yet lived." One evening, while sweeping his cell, he overheard a scholar reciting a verse nearby. "Does he not know that God sees?" Quran 96:14. The words pierced him. He had spent his life debating how God sees, when, and why. But now, it simply struck him that God was watching him even as he swept dust off the floor. He laughed softly, no, not from mockery, but from relief. The Almighty had never been an idea. He had been present all along. From that night, Al-Ghazali began to write again. Not as a jurist, but as a soul, trembling under divine gaze. His pen no longer sought victory, but clarity. He called it the writing of the heart after it has been broken open. After 2 years in Damascus, he felt a call, faint but persistent. His steps turned toward Jerusalem, the city of the prophets. He walked alone, carrying nothing but a wool cloak and his renewed faith. When he entered the Masjid al-Aqsa, he prayed beneath its golden dome until his tears pooled on the stone floor. The dome shimmered in dawn light. He later wrote that in that moment, "I felt the heart rise above the mind, and the intellect kneel before its creator." He stayed in Jerusalem until his longing grew unbearable. He needed to see the house of God itself, to return to where Ibrahim had once stood, where tears and dust were prayers alike. He joined the caravans bound for Mecca. Along the long desert road, the wind became his teacher. Sandstorms erased the path each night, reminding him that the journey to God has no map, only faith. In Mecca, surrounded by pilgrims chanting, "Labbaik Allahumma labbaik," he felt smaller than he had ever felt before. He had debated philosophers who claimed certainty. Now he stood among the illiterate and poor who carried hearts purer than his. He realized that the truest knowledge was humility, and that the greatest proof of God was love. He didn't write for months after that. He just watched the faces of strangers, each one a mirror of his own search. And he thought, perhaps God hides his light in the hearts of those we overlook. After years of wandering, Al-Ghazali returned to Syria, then to Baghdad briefly. The scholars there begged him to resume his lectures, but he refused. He said softly, "I cannot teach what I no longer own. My heart is still in the desert." Instead, he began to write what would become Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences. Not a book of law, but of life. He poured his transformation into words that spoke not to scholars, but to souls, on sincerity, hypocrisy, love, and death. He no longer debated the existence of God. He described the experience of him. He no longer sought truth as an object. He lived it as a presence. And for the first time, his intellect served his heart. He had left the world behind to find God, but God in mercy was now leading him back to the world, reborn. Because faith that hides forever in solitude is only half-born. It must return to heal the lives it once ignored. But when the call to return came, would he obey it? Or fear that the world might devour him again? And if he returned, what would he say to the empire he once dazzled, now that his eyes had seen eternity? Years had passed since the scholar of Baghdad vanished into silence. The world whispered rumors that he had gone mad, that he had died, that he had joined Sufis who lived on nothing but prayer. But one morning, a traveler entered Baghdad's Nizamiya college and said softly, "He lives." Al-Ghazali had been seen again, not as the golden-tongued professor, but as a man whose eyes carried the peace of someone who had walked through fire and found water. Yet within him, the battle was not over. He had tasted solitude and feared the world's noise would drown the voice of his heart again. He prayed for guidance. And one night, as he drifted into sleep, he felt a thought descend, not as logic, but as light. The truth is not yours to hoard. What I have shown you was never meant to be hidden. When dawn came, he knew. He must return, not to reclaim fame, but to share what he had discovered in the emptiness. As he walked once more into Baghdad, the city buzzed with life. Merchants shouted, children ran through the streets, and scholars gathered in circles of debate. Nothing had changed, except him. He paused before the towering doors of the Nizamiya, the same ones he had left years ago. They now seemed heavier, as if guarding the ghosts of his old self. When he entered, the murmurs stopped. Faces turned, startled. Some students wept. Others whispered, "He has returned." He climbed the lectern again, the same place from which his tongue once commanded empires of reason. But this time, his first words were not a triumph. They were a confession. "Brothers, I once sought to prove God through logic. Now I know that the mind can point the way, but only the heart can arrive." A hush filled the hall. Some bowed their heads in awe. Others frowned. For what scholar begins his lesson with surrender? Gone was the Al-Ghazali who destroyed opponents with precision. The man before them spoke softly, weaving parables and prayers, inviting reflection rather than applause. He warned his students, "Knowledge without humility is a mirror without light. You may see yourself in it, but never your Lord." He taught that there were three kinds of knowledge: of the tongue, recited but not lived; of the mind, understood but unstable; of the heart, lived, breathed, and purified by remembrance. Only the last, he said, leads to peace. He began compiling his new insights, pages that would become the Ihya Ulum al-Din. The work was unlike anything written before. It spoke of sincerity, the dangers of pride, the sweetness of repentance, and the unseen diseases of the soul. He wrote it not as a manual, but as a mirror, so every reader might meet themselves inside. Not everyone rejoiced. Some scholars accused him of blurring the line between reason and mysticism. He has abandoned philosophy for dreams, they said. He replaced certainty with emotion. But Al-Ghazali did not argue. He had spent half a lifetime winning debates and lost himself in the victories. Now, he simply smiled and replied, "Let them speak. I once spoke louder, and it brought me no closer to God." He no longer sought to defeat minds. He wanted to awaken hearts. At night, he often walked to the courtyard, where the students once gathered by torchlight. He would sit alone, watching their young faces glow with ambition. It reminded him of himself, the boy who had chased wisdom like a crown, forgetting the one who gives it. Sometimes he would whisper into the stillness, "My Lord, if I must teach again, then make every word a bridge to you, not a monument to me." And slowly he began to see the fruits of that prayer. His students changed. Debates softened. Worship deepened. Many later wrote that they had seen something in his eyes that was neither knowledge nor power, but a peace that defied reason. It wasn't the return of the professor. It was the rebirth of a servant. Yet even in his peace, the pull of solitude remained. After years of teaching, Al-Ghazali received news from Tus, his hometown. His brother Ahmad had established a small Sufi lodge near their old family home. He hesitated. Baghdad needed him, or so they said, but his heart yearned for the quiet streets of his youth, the place where his father once copied manuscripts by candlelight. He prayed again for a sign, and in a dream, he saw a lamp flicker in a dark house. A voice said, "You have lit the world enough. Go light your own home before you return to me." When he awoke, tears streamed down his face. He understood. The time had come to go home. Not as the scholar of Baghdad, but as the man who had finally found the heart he once lost, in pursuit of the mind. He gathered his manuscripts, kissed the threshold of the Nizamiya, and left the city before dawn, just as he had left years before, but this time without fear. He no longer ran from the world. He was now walking toward peace. But what awaited him in Tus? Would the world's noise truly fade? Or would the weight of destiny call him once more to speak for the generations yet unborn? When Al-Ghazali returned to Tus, the air smelled of earth after rain, quiet, familiar, forgiving. The hills that had watched his boyhood now greeted him as an old friend. Children chased goats through narrow lanes, their laughter free of philosophy. And somewhere beyond the olive trees stood the modest home his brother Ahmad had built beside a small zawiya, a lodge for seekers of God. As he crossed the threshold, Ahmad embraced him and whispered, "You left the world to find truth. Welcome home, Abu Hamid. Perhaps now truth will find you." For the first time in years, Al-Ghazali allowed himself to breathe without expectation. No courtiers, no debates, no titles, only the sound of the wind against the wooden door and the pages of the Quran turning softly at dawn. The lodge became his new Nizamiya, but its ceiling was the sky and its carpet the dust. Students came in small numbers, drawn not by reputation but by longing. Some were scholars, disillusioned with their own brilliance. Others were farmers who could barely read. He treated them the same. Every lesson began not with proofs, but with silence. He would close his eyes until the stillness deepened, then ask, "What did your heart learn today that your mind ignored?" At first they thought it a riddle. Later they realized it was the essence of his teaching. He told them, "When knowledge becomes pride, it imprisons you. When it becomes service, it frees you. Seek the freedom that kneels." Within those stone walls, he wrote by lamplight until dawn. His hand trembled from age, yet his pen flowed with purpose. The Ihya Ulum al-Din grew into 4 great volumes on worship, social dealings, destructive vices, and saving virtues. He wrote of the subtle diseases that poison the soul: ostentation, envy, greed, self-admiration. He wrote that repentance is not a single act, but a river that cleanses as long as it flows. And always, between the lines, he reminded the reader, faith is not an argument, it is a transformation. Sometimes when Don's first call to prayer echoed across Tus, he would stop writing, place his pen down, and whisper, "O Lord, Let these words live only if they lead someone back to you. Otherwise, let the ink fade. News of his retreat spread. Students, governors, even rival theologians traveled for weeks to see him. Some sought answers, others sought peace. One evening, a young scholar arrived from Nishapur, proud and eloquent. He bowed and asked, "Master, what is the proof that God exists?" Al-Ghazali smiled gently. "You are breathing," he said. "That is proof enough." The scholar frowned. "But that is no argument." "Indeed," Al-Ghazali replied, "and that is why it reaches the heart." The young man stayed for weeks and left in tears. He would later say that in Tus, he learned more from the silence of the Imam than from all the disputations of his youth. As years passed, Al-Ghazali felt time's whisper in his bones. His hair silvered, his frame grew thin, yet his eyes carried the calm of someone who had already crossed death in spirit and found life again. He often told his pupils, "Every night we lie down as if in a grave. Blessed is the one who wakes as if resurrected." He knew his days were numbered, but fear no longer haunted him. He had already faced the death of ego, the harder death. Sometimes after the evening prayer, he would sit beneath the pomegranate tree outside his lodge, watching the stars. Each star, he mused, is a word in God's unspoken book. We chase meanings while forgetting the author. Then, with a faint smile, he'd ask his students, "Tell me, if the stars obey without knowing, why do we disobey while claiming to understand?" Though peace had found him, a question remained. Should he stay hidden in Tus, or return again to guide the confused scholars of the empire? Letters arrived from Baghdad begging his presence. Some said the youth were losing their way to empty philosophy, that only his wisdom could restore balance. But his heart hesitated. He had learned that guidance is not measured by distance, but by sincerity. He wrote back, "I have taught with my tongue. Now I wish to teach with my silence. Let them read the stillness God has written on my face." Still, students kept coming, waves of them. And slowly he realized the hermitage had become an unseen university. What he fled from had followed him, purified. As his final decade approached, Al-Ghazali began a smaller book, almost secret, The Alchemy of Happiness. He wrote it not for scholars, but for souls. In it, he confessed that all his years of reasoning had been a circle leading back to one point. The key to salvation lies within the self. Whoever knows himself knows his Lord. Yet even as he wrote, he would pause, close the manuscript, and gaze at the candlelight flickering. "The mind finds patterns," he whispered, "but the heart finds presence." The night wind would answer in silence. He had finally found harmony, the intellect and the spirit no longer at war, but kneeling side by side before the same majesty. But destiny had one more lesson for him, a final test that would prove whether the heart he found could face the end with peace. Dawn crept over Tus with its usual gentleness, yet something in the air felt different. The wind carried the stillness of a farewell. Inside the modest lodge, Imam Al-Ghazali sat cross-legged beside a small oil lamp. The flame quivered as if listening. He had risen long before the call to prayer, performed ablution, and wrapped himself in a clean white shroud. To his students, it looked like preparation for prayer. To him, it was rehearsal for eternity. He had written deep into the night, completing the last lines of The Alchemy of Happiness. His handwriting, once bold and sharp, now softened, letters bending as if bowing before their maker. When he finished, he placed the pen beside the manuscript and whispered, "My Lord, if there is any pride in these pages, erase it. Let only your mercy remain." As the first light touched the courtyard, his pupils gathered for the daily recitation. He greeted each by name, his voice calm but hollow with distance, like someone speaking from the edge of another world. He asked them to recite the Quran, beginning with Surat Yasin. The sound filled the room, a river of remembrance flowing around their master. When they finished, he closed his eyes and said quietly, "If the heart listens to these words and still does not tremble, then it has mistaken life for a dream." The students exchanged uneasy glances. They sensed he was teaching his final lesson. He then spoke of death, not as an ending, but as a meeting long delayed. "Fear not its darkness," he said. "It is only the veil drawn before the sunrise." After the prayer, he withdrew to his room. His brother Ahmad followed with concern. The Imam smiled and said, "Dear brother, today I meet the one I spoke of all my life, and of whom I knew so little." Ahmad wept. "Rest, Abu Hamid. You are weak." "I am not weak," he replied. "I am being lightened." He asked for his burial shroud again, kissed it, and laid it on his chest. Then he turned toward the Qibla, closed his eyes, and began reciting softly, "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." His lips moved until the words faded into breath, and the breath into stillness. The lodge fell silent. Outside, birds stirred as if reluctant to sing. Ahmad entered and found his brother's face serene, a faint smile resting where the final sigh had escaped. In his hand was a small note, written moments before dawn. "O brothers, the journey is long, the provision light, but the guide is near. Seek him, and you will find yourselves." They buried him beside his father, under the same soil that once carried his childhood footprints. The town gathered, scholars and peasants alike, united not by his fame, but by the peace radiating from his absence. In the days that followed, the lodge and Tus glowed with quiet purpose. Students copied his manuscripts by hand, their tears smudging the ink. Travelers arrived from every province, seeking not his words, but the feeling his words left behind. Some claimed that on calm nights, when the wind swept through the pomegranate tree outside his grave, they heard a whisper, "The heart that remembers its Lord never dies." Whether myth or mercy, no one could say. But all agreed, the man who once conquered the intellect of an empire had conquered something far greater, himself. Years turned to decades, and his books crossed deserts and seas. The Ihya became the soul of scholars and the solace of mystics. Kings quoted him. Saints wept over his pages. Even those who opposed him could not escape the truth that echoed from his life. Knowledge must bow before love. He had walked away from the world, not to escape it, but to cleanse it through his return. His silence had become scripture for every mind that sought the heart. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. The rustle of parchment in a lamplit cell, the soft hum of verses mingling with tears, the sound of a mind surrendering to its maker. He taught that faith begins where certainty ends, that every argument eventually kneels. That doubt is not the enemy of belief, but its doorway. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Because every soul, at some point, must walk away from what it knows to find what it truly believes. But what would the world have become had he not walked away? Would faith still have found its bridge between intellect and heart? Or did God choose him precisely so that both would meet in one trembling soul beneath one eternal light? Death quieted his breath, but not his influence. From the clay of Tus, his name began to travel farther than his body ever had. Caravans carried his manuscripts east to Khwarezm and Samarkand, west to Baghdad and Cairo, and beyond to the libraries of Al-Andalus. Everywhere they went, hearts turned toward the strange new fragrance rising from his pages. Certainty wrapped in humility. The scholars who had once questioned him now copied his work by candlelight. The same pens that had written rebuttals began writing commentaries instead. And in each commentary was a confession. He wrote what we all feared to admit, that faith without heart is noise. Generations later, his Ihya became the unseen curriculum of the Muslim world. Madrasas taught it in hushed tones. Merchants quoted its maxims between transactions. Its four quarters, worship, customs, vices, and virtues, became the map by which ordinary souls navigated extraordinary times. Somewhere in Damascus, a student reciting its passages paused and said, "When I read him, I feel my chest widen." In Fez, another replied, "When I read him, I feel watched by God." They had never met the man, yet his words spoke as if he were sitting beside them under the lamplight. That was the miracle of Al-Ghazali. He taught presence through absence. Philosophers tried to classify him, theologians to claim him, mystics to interpret him. But he escaped all cages. To the philosophers, he was proof that logic and faith could share a language. To the Sufis, he was the scholar who dared to weep. To the jurists, he was the jurist who remembered mercy. And in that union, the world found a bridge that had long been missing. He had built it not of arguments, but of surrender. On one side stood intellect, cold and precise. On the other, devotion, warm but blind. Al-Ghazali laid himself down between them, and the two finally met. Centuries passed. His Arabic became Latin, his thoughts crossing into Europe through translations from Toledo and Sicily. Christian theologians studied him. Philosophers like Aquinas and Bonaventure echoed his reasoning on the harmony between revelation and intellect. In monasteries, monks debated the same questions he had wrestled with in Baghdad. Few of them knew the name of Tus or the face of the man they quoted. Yet they were breathing the air he had purified. That true wisdom bows before the mystery of God. The ripples of one heart had reached oceans he never saw. Back in the East, his legacy divided those who misunderstood its depth. Some reduced him to a slogan, the destroyer of philosophers. Others idolized him as if he had erased doubt forever. But those who truly read him found a gentler truth. He never sought to kill reason, only to baptize it in humility. He had written, paraphrased from his Munkid min al-Dalal, "When I examined my motives, I found that my search for truth had been tainted by pride. So God shattered the mirror of my vanity until I saw nothing but him." Those lines became a lantern for every scholar who realized that the greatest heresy is arrogance in the name of knowledge. Stories grew around his grave. Some said travelers lost in Khorasan would see a faint light flickering in the distance and follow it safely to Tus. Others swore they had heard verses recited from beneath the soil on certain nights of prayer. Ahmad, his brother, would smile whenever people told such tales. "You do not need to believe them," he said. "Believe instead that a man's sincerity never dies." And perhaps that was truer than all the legends, for sincerity leaves echoes louder than fame. 2 centuries later, when scholars struggled again with dry ritual and hollow debate, they reopened the Ihya and found it breathing. It reminded them that worship without intention is motion without meaning, and that law without compassion is tyranny disguised as order. Even reformers of later ages, men and women who would never see Tus, drew from his well. His idea of self-examination became the seed of spiritual psychology. His warnings against pride became the moral compass of countless teachers. Wherever hearts thirsted for balance, his memory returned like rain. He had sought to know God, and in doing so, helped humanity know itself. The man who once trembled before his own doubt had become the voice through which faith learned to speak again. But how does one measure such a life? By the books he left, or by the souls he awakened? And if both perish one day, will the light still linger, unseen but felt, like warmth from a fire long extinguished? Time moved on, but the echo of Al-Ghazali refused to fade. His books had spread like seeds on every wind, and wherever they landed, they grew, sometimes into gardens of wisdom, sometimes into thickets of debate. In the centuries that followed, whole schools of thought wrestled with his ghost. To some, he was the savior of faith. To others, the man who made reason bow too low. Yet even his fiercest critics could not step outside the world he had redrawn. He had not simply written about God. He had redesigned how humanity approached him. In Damascus and Cairo, Sufi orders adopted his Ihya as their mirror. Disciples sat cross-legged in candlelit rooms, reading his chapters on sincerity until tears blurred the ink. They called him Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam, because he had proven that faith could think and thought could believe. One sheikh told his students, before him, the learned feared emotion. After him, they feared its absence. They quoted him in their dhikr circles, his words mingling with the names of God. Every whisper of remembrance carried a trace of the scholar who had once wept in the Umayyad Mosque. But not all hearts bent easily. Centuries later, the philosophers of Andalusia rose to defend reason's throne. Ibn Rushd, Averroes, the brilliant judge of Cordoba, read Al-Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers and answered with The Incoherence of the Incoherence, a title as defiant as it was respectful. He argued that Al-Ghazali had wounded philosophy too deeply, that revelation and rational inquiry were allies, not rivals. And yet, between his lines, he admitted a reluctant admiration. He struck the branches, not the root. Thus began a dialogue that outlived both men, a divine tension between intellect and illumination. The Muslim world would spend centuries walking that bridge, sometimes leaning to one side, sometimes the other, but never forgetting who built it. Farther east, in Persia and India, poets found in him a friend. Rumi called him the candle that burned the self to show the path. Attar wove him into parables. Jamie recited his teachings beside verses of longing. Through them, the scholarly robe of Al-Ghazali transformed into poetry, his logic softened into rhythm, his definitions into sighs. The same truths that once filled lecture halls now danced in lovers' songs. It was as if his spirit had melted into music. And perhaps that was the truest continuation of his work, because what he had sought all along was not precision, but presence. Meanwhile, in the cathedrals of Europe, his influence whispered through unfamiliar tongues. Scholastics borrowed his arguments on causality and divine will. Theologians read his reconciliations between reason and revelation. Some even cited him anonymously, fearing the church's suspicion of Islamic sources. But God's truths have never required passports. The mind that found the heart in Tus had quietly helped a continent rediscover its soul. As centuries turned into empires, every age tried to claim him. Mystics called him theirs. Rationalists said he merely confirmed their path. Reformers held up his humility. Conservatives, his orthodoxy. But each grasped only one thread of the tapestry. Al-Ghazali was not a banner to wave. He was a mirror to face. And mirrors, by their nature, unsettle before they heal. Those who truly studied him learned that his greatest lesson was not what to think, but how to keep thinking without losing faith. In one chronicle from Nishapur, a student wrote, "When I read his books, I feel both exposed and embraced. He shows me my hypocrisy, then teaches me to forgive it." That is what made him timeless. He did not promise purity. He promised transformation. Even now, under the same sky that once lit his lamp, his words survive not because they were flawless, but because they were honest. He had been the scholar brave enough to confess confusion, and the saint humble enough to admit that confusion itself can be holy. The world kept arguing over his legacy, unaware that the debate was his final sermon. He had never wanted consensus, only awakening. And as long as minds and hearts wrestle, his mission lives on. But can one man's sincerity outlast the ages of forgetting? Or does every generation need to rediscover him anew, as if hearing his voice for the first time, whispering from the ruins of certainty, "Walk away, and you will find me waiting." Centuries passed, dynasties fell, and libraries turned to dust, but somehow Al-Ghazali's light stayed. It did not blaze like empire banners. It glimmered quietly, woven into the habits of learning, prayer, and reflection. When the Ottoman madrasas rose from Anatolia to the Balkans, their curricula carried traces of him. Logic tempered by ethics, law softened by compassion, philosophy anchored by faith. Few students noticed his name in the margins, yet every lesson bore his rhythm, the steady heartbeat of balance. One chronicler wrote, "In our schools, the tongue argues, but the heart listens." This is the inheritance of Al-Ghazali. It was true. His method had outlived his biography. The empire's teachers called it Tajdid al-Man, the renewal of faith. Each generation, they said, must rescue religion from habit, as Al-Ghazali once rescued it from arrogance. And so, century after century, his ihya returned like spring rain after drought. In Istanbul, scholars read his chapters on humility before entering court. In Cairo, judges recited his warnings about pride before issuing verdicts. In Herat and Delhi, mystics opened their lessons with his parable of the heart as a mirror. Polish it through remembrance, for every sin is dust. The ihya was no longer a book. It was a culture of conscience. Then came modernity, telescopes, factories, printing presses, and revolutions of thought. The old certainties trembled. Faith, once the air itself, now had to defend its existence. In that age, the world rediscovered Al-Ghazali as if he had been writing for them all along. Philosophers praised his courage to face skepticism from within. Psychologists found in his writings the first anatomy of the inner self. Educators called him the father of moral intelligence. He had described the soul's confusion 9 centuries before the word existential was born. One European scholar translated him and sighed in his diary, "He speaks to the disease of our century, as if he lived in it." Even outside Islam, seekers began quoting him in silence retreats and universities. A Christian monk in Mount Athos copied a passage from The Alchemy of Happiness on his cell wall. "Do not seek to see him with the eyes of flesh, but purify the eyes of the heart." A Jewish philosopher in Prague taught his students that Al-Ghazali's method of self-examination mirrored the Prophet's call to humility. And a young Indian reformer, centuries later, would build his moral education programs on the Ghazalian triad: knowledge, action, sincerity. He had become the teacher of teachers without ever founding a school. In the 20th century, his thought reemerged in classrooms and counseling rooms alike. Scholars wrote dissertations on his logic. Spiritual mentors quoted his confessions of doubt. He became a bridge once more, between science and soul, between data and meaning. A psychologist in Cairo read his work and told her students, before Freud spoke of ego and superego, Al-Ghazali spoke of the commanding soul, the blaming soul, and the peaceful soul. He knew our fractures long before we gave them Latin names. And indeed, modern readers found themselves reflected in his pages. The questions were ancient, the ache entirely current. Walk into a quiet mosque at dawn, a study circle in Istanbul, a library in Jakarta, or a podcast recorded in New York, and somewhere you will find him. Not in marble statues or slogans, but in the vocabulary of sincerity. Every time someone says, "I must cleanse my intention," they are speaking his language. Every time a teacher reminds a student, "Knowledge without humility corrupts," they are echoing his voice. Every time a thinker confesses, "My logic cannot hold what my heart feels," they are repeating his journey. The man of Tus has become a quiet companion of the modern conscience. He had once feared that his books might die with him. Instead, they became breath passing invisibly between generations, unclaimed yet indispensable. And perhaps that is the proof of divine acceptance. When a man's name fades, but his truth keeps working. Yet the story of Imam Al-Ghazali does not end with admiration. It ends where it began, with the question he carried all his life: can the heart ever be fully known by the mind that seeks it? The 19th century was an age of awakening and anxiety. Empires shrank, machines roared, and faith, long the heartbeat of society, was forced to answer the hum of reason once again. In cafes from Cairo to Calcutta, young intellectuals argued not over revelation, but relevance. Could religion still guide a world that measured everything by steel, speed, and certainty? And in those smoky debates, someone always whispered one name: Al-Ghazali, because 9 centuries earlier, he had already lived their crisis and survived it with his soul intact. Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, the restless revolutionary, urged Muslim nations to reclaim moral strength before military power. When critics asked what kind of revival he meant, he opened the Ihya and said, "This." His disciple, Muhammad Abdu of Egypt, echoed the same vision. He united intellect and heart, Abdu told his students, and until we do the same, we will wander between imitation and disbelief. Across the Indian Ocean, Shah Waliullah of Delhi rebuilt Islamic education on that balance, rational discipline shaped by inner reform. He wrote that every generation must renew faith from within the self, a sentence lifted almost word for word from Al-Ghazali's own confession. The revivalists of the age found in him not a saint to worship, but a pattern to follow. Face the collapse of meaning, walk through doubt, and emerge purified. But it was the poets who carried his fire into hearts untrained in theology. Allama Iqbal, the philosopher-poet of the 20th century, called him the first Muslim psychologist. In his reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, Iqbal praised Al-Ghazali for rescuing faith from the rigidity of logic and returning it to the warm current of life. He wrote, "In him, the intellect discovered its own limits and found in surrender not defeat, but flight." For Iqbal, that surrender was the seed of creative selfhood, the khudi, the self that knows its worth before God. Through Iqbal's verses, Al-Ghazali's voice reached microphones in schoolrooms, sung by tongues that never read Arabic but felt its truth. By mid-century, as colonial rule faded and new nations struggled for identity, Muslim thinkers reopened the question that haunted Baghdad in his time. What does it mean to know? Malik Benabi in Algeria found in him an antidote to spiritual paralysis. Sayyid Qutb, before politics hardened his pen, studied the Ihya and wrote of reviving the consciousness of God in the bloodstream of society. And in Iran, Murtaza Mutahari and Ali Shariati drew from his integration of mind and faith to shape the moral compass of a generation. Whether they agreed or rebelled, they could not escape the orbit of the man from Tus. Meanwhile, the West, restless under its own success, rediscovered him through translation. University presses printed The Alchemy of Happiness for Psychology courses. A London journalist called him the Muslim Augustine. Retreat centers in the Alps read his chapters on purifying intention alongside Christian mystics. One convert to Islam wrote after reading him, "He did not teach me how to pray. He taught me why to pray." In cafes of Paris and New York, his aphorisms began appearing on posters and websites. Actions are but the shells, intentions are the pearls. He had become, without ever meaning to, the theologian of sincerity for a world drowning in performance. In our own century, the hum of Baghdad's debates has turned into the buzz of online arguments. Yet the same ache remains. People scroll endlessly for meaning, their screens bright but their hearts dim. And there too, Al-Ghazali speaks, through lectures, podcasts, and digital classrooms, bearing his name. Teachers quote his warning, "When the world is too loud for silence, retreat into remembrance." Spiritual coaches cite his line, "The ego is a thief that wears your own face." Even neuroscientists reference him when discussing the alignment of thought and emotion. It seems every generation, when exhausted by knowledge, returns to the scholar who walked away from it. Why does his voice survive while so many others fade? Because he never argued for an ideology. He chronicled a transformation. He showed that truth does not fear scrutiny, that faith need not silence the mind, and that God's nearness is not proven, it is experienced. And perhaps the modern world, with all its brilliance and loneliness, still waits for that experience. He remains the reminder that salvation is not in choosing between logic and love, but in letting both kneel before the same light. But will humanity, once more enchanted by its inventions, remember to kneel? Or will it need another soul to walk away again, so that we might follow the echo back to the heart. 9 centuries after his death, the world has changed beyond recognition, yet the human soul has not. Cities now shimmer with glass and light instead of oil lamps, but beneath the noise the same questions whisper. What am I for? Why do I feel hollow in abundance? How do I find peace? And though most could not name him, the answers they seek were already spoken by a scholar who once left everything behind to feel his own heartbeat. In a crowded classroom in Jakarta, a young teacher begins her day with a quiet prayer before the students arrive. She has memorized every lesson plan, every rule of pedagogy. But what she worries about most is not being understood. It is teaching without presence. So she tells herself what she once read on a yellowed page shared by a friend. Knowledge is a seed that grows only in humility. She does not know the author's name. She only knows that when she remembers those words, her tone softens and her students listen differently. She is, unknowingly, one of Al-Ghazali's students. Across the ocean, in a laboratory humming with machines, a neuroscientist stares at a screen of flickering brainwaves. He studies attention, trying to explain why mindfulness changes neural patterns. When he presents his research, he admits, half smiling, "We keep finding evidence that intention changes physiology. Perhaps the ancients knew this before us." Later, alone, he rereads a passage a colleague had quoted. "The heart is the king, and the limbs its soldiers. When the king is sound, the realm is sound." It was written by Al-Ghazali nearly a millennium ago, and as he reads, the scientist feels the gap between science and spirit narrow to a thread of awe. In a small studio in Istanbul, a calligrapher grinds ink as dawnlight pours through the window. Each stroke of his pen is deliberate, a meditation. Above his desk hangs a line he copied years ago. Beauty is the reflection of truth when the heart is clean. He does not chase fame, he chases stillness. When people ask about his discipline, he smiles. Every letter teaches humility. He does not realize he is living Al-Ghazali's theology of intention, ihsan made visible. Even in the digital labyrinths of today, his voice finds echoes. A young woman in Chicago scrolls through a feed of endless distractions. Between news and noise, a quote appears, "Remember death often, for it purifies love." She pauses. For a moment, the algorithm fades and stillness enters. She closes the app, whispers a prayer, and goes for a walk. That one breath of mindfulness is the same doorway Al-Ghazali once opened in Damascus, a bridge between the ordinary and the divine. From Lagos to London, from Kuala Lumpur to Kansas, millions search for meaning in a world that rewards noise. Some attend lectures titled The Revival of the Heart. Others read self-help books that unknowingly paraphrase his alchemy of happiness. Some meditate, others journal their sins and gratitude. Different languages, same hunger. They are all walking his path. Though the path now winds through modern lives, past deadlines and data, still leading to the same silence he found in prayer. And perhaps this is the truest miracle, that a man who fled the crowds now speaks through them. That a scholar who once doubted his sincerity now revives it in strangers. That a seeker who died alone in Tus lives in every heart that asks honestly, "Am I nearer to God or farther?" He once wrote, paraphrased, "The proof that light exists is not argument, but sight." And so his legacy survives, not by persuasion, but by recognition, the moment a soul glimpses its own reflection in the mirror he left behind. The world keeps rushing forward, yet somewhere within its motion, a quiet pattern repeats. Someone stops. Someone listens. Someone begins again. That too is Tajdud, the renewal he promised. But if God revives faith in every age, who will be the next to walk away from the world so that hearts may return? And when that one appears, will we have the courage to follow the silence again? In his final writings, Imam Al-Ghazali no longer argued. He described. He had moved past proving truth and begun charting its terrain. The same man who once analyzed philosophy now drew a map of the soul so vivid that even centuries later, every pilgrim of meaning could find themselves somewhere upon it. He called it the journey to God through the self. 4 stages, simple in words, infinite in depth: awakening, purification, illumination, and reunion. It begins, he said, when the heart wakes up. The world suddenly feels louder, the victories emptier, the mirror less flattering. What once satisfied now leaves a strange ache. He called this yakza, the shaking of the sleeper. Blessed, he wrote, is the one whom God wakes while life still remains, before the night of death completes its mercy. It is the moment when a soul realizes that comfort is not peace, and that success is not safety. For Al-Ghazali, this was the tremor that began in Baghdad, the crack through which grace entered. Every seeker since has known the same tremor, that quiet rebellion of the heart, whispering, "There must be more." Once awake, the traveler faces a storm, the cleansing of the heart. He compared the soul to a mirror, once pure, now clouded by smoke and dust. No one can see the divine reflection until they wipe away pride, envy, greed, and fear. He warned that repentance without persistence is polishing with muddy water. Real purification, he said, is the habit of humility. He wrote in the Ihya, "Whoever knows the faults of his soul has been given a lantern from his Lord." For Al-Ghazali, the first proof of faith was self-awareness. He did not condemn the sinner. He condemned the blindness that pretends sin is nothing. Purification was not punishment. It was the slow surgery of love. Then comes nur, light. Not the light of intellect, but of intimacy. After the mirror is cleared, illumination arises from within, and knowledge becomes experience. He described it like the sunrise, gradual, soft, unstoppable. The heart begins to see meaning in everything: the grain of sand, the breath between words, the mercy inside pain. He wrote, paraphrased, "When the heart becomes pure, the veil lifts. What was once belief becomes sight." This illumination does not make the seeker proud, it makes him small, for true light reveals how vast God is and how near. It was in this stage that Al-Ghazali wrote, "The Alchemy of Happiness," speaking not to scholars but to souls. The sun shines even upon the blind. So too does God's mercy upon the heedless. But when the eyes of the heart open, the whole world becomes prayer. Finally comes wusul, arrival. But in his telling, arrival was not escape into heaven. It was recognition on earth. He said the traveler does not reach God by walking away from creation, but by seeing the Creator in every atom. When the self dissolves in remembrance, the heart no longer says, "I believe." It says, "I am sustained." This is the serenity that had once filled his face in Tus, when he whispered before dying, "I am being lightened." Reunion is not the end of the path. It is the beginning of service. He wrote, "The sign of arrival is not visions, but virtue." When love of God turns into love of his creation, then the journey is complete. Through these stages, Al-Ghazali turned his crisis into a compass. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Every age rediscovers itself within his map. The modern seeker who wakes up in anxiety, the repentant who struggles to stay pure, the mystic who glimpses a spark of light, the teacher who returns to serve. They are all footprints on the same road he walked. His language may have been ink, but his destination was silence. And silence, unlike ink, does not fade. So the mind that once sought to master God ended up bowing to wonder. And in that surrender, the scholar became a saint, the debater became a devotee, and the man who once feared ignorance finally found peace in not knowing, because he had met the knower. But if the heart's journey never truly ends, then where are we now upon his map? Are we still asleep or just beginning to awaken? And will we, like him, have the courage to follow that first tremor all the way to light? The centuries between him and us have blurred everything except the ache he named. People now live among circuits and screens instead of scrolls and sand. Yet the pattern repeats. The heart hungers, the mind argues, the silence waits. Al-Ghazali's stages, awakening, purification, illumination, reunion, are no longer chapters in a book. They are rhythms in modern lives. His map has simply changed scenery. A programmer in Silicon Valley finishes another sleepless night debugging code. Success tastes metallic. In the hum of servers, he hears his own fatigue whisper, "Is this all?" He does not know the word yakza, yet the tremor is the same one that once shook a scholar in Baghdad. The next day, he turns off his phone for an hour and watches sunlight move across the wall. It is his first prayer in years, and his first breath that feels real. Across the world, a woman who once built her life on appearances scrolls through old photos and feels only distance. The smile in the pictures looks borrowed. She opens a journal and writes the first honest line in decades. "I miss the person I was before I tried to impress everyone." She begins small. Apologies sent, debts repaid, gossip unsaid. Each act wipes a layer of dust from the mirror inside. When she reads a line online, whoever knows the faults of his soul has been given a lantern from his Lord. She feels seen. She never learns the author's name. But Al-Ghazali has found her. In a refugee camp in Jordan, a volunteer doctor treats wounds by flashlight. Between patients, she prays quickly on the sand. One night, a child she saved brings her a wilted flower. For a moment, exhaustion dissolves into quiet joy. She writes in her diary, "I think I saw God today in the eyes of a child." That recognition, the divine hidden in the ordinary, is illumination. It is the same light Al-Ghazali saw in Damascus when he realized the poor worship more purely than kings. An old taxi driver in Cairo begins every shift with Bismillah. He drives through chaos, humming Quran between honks. When asked how he stays calm, he laughs, "I see his plan in every red light." He has no books, no degrees, but he lives reunion, the constant awareness that every breath is mercy. Al-Ghazali would have loved him. The scholar spent a lifetime reaching the simplicity this man carries without effort. What unites these strangers is not creed or culture. It is transformation. Each has turned confusion into clarity, guilt into gratitude, exhaustion into worship. That was Al-Ghazali's true alchemy, changing the lead of everyday struggle into the gold of remembrance. He once wrote, paraphrased, "Every heart is a vessel. Fill it with what remains after the world is gone." In a century obsessed with what fades, that line feels like prophecy. His story reminds us that God's guidance rarely arrives on schedule. It comes when the soul has finally grown quiet enough to listen. The scholar lost his voice before he found his truth. The seeker today may lose a job, a friend, or a dream, and discover the same mercy disguised as loss. For in divine arithmetic, subtraction is preparation. The lamp he lit in Tus still burns, passed hand to hand through the dark corridors of history. It burns in classrooms and laboratories, in mosques and bedrooms, in anyone who pauses mid-noise and remembers that faith begins with listening. He walked away so that we might learn to walk within. But have we learned? When our lives grow loud again, will we remember the silence he offered? Or will God, in mercy, send another wanderer to remind us that light waits on the other side of letting go? The fire that once burned in Al-Ghazali's study has long gone cold, yet the light it kindled has never dimmed. Every century since has proven what he discovered in silence, that the mind can build paths to God, but only the heart can walk them. He did not kill reason, he baptized it. He did not abandon learning, he purified its intention. He showed that intellect without love becomes arrogance, and love without intellect becomes chaos. Between the two, he found worship. In his language, every act had syntax. The intellect was the noun, strong, visible, structural. The heart was the verb, motion, meaning, life. When the noun stood alone, it was proud, but still. When the verb moved without subject, it was passion without purpose. Together they formed a sentence that reached heaven. That sentence is the secret grammar of faith. I believe, not as a statement of possession, but of movement. To say I believe is to let the mind understand and the heart respond. He built an entire civilization on that harmony. He wrote once, paraphrased, "There are two lights, one of the intellect and one of revelation. When they meet in the same soul, that soul becomes the sun of its age." And so the scholars who came after him, scientists, poets, jurists, and saints, were all children of those twin rays. They could reason deeply and still weep during prayer. They could love fiercely and still think clearly. They could be modern without being hollow. The world has never needed that union more than now. Today, the mind runs faster than ever, but the heart limps behind. We can calculate galaxies, yet struggle to sit in silence. We build machines that learn, but forget to ask if they should. Our generation is brilliant, connected, and quietly broken. Al-Ghazali would have recognized this illness. He saw it in the courts of Baghdad. The same pride disguised as progress, the same worship of intellect without gratitude. His remedy would be the same. Return to the mirror, clean it. He would not condemn our science, he would sanctify our purpose. He would tell the engineer, build as prayer. The doctor, heal as remembrance. The writer, speak only what awakens hearts. And the believer, never separate thought from tenderness. In the end, his lesson is disarmingly simple. You find the heart not by chasing emotion, but by aligning your entire being toward truth. When every argument, every breath, every ambition bows to the same light, that is faith. When you see beauty and instead of claiming it, you whisper, Subhanallah, that is reunion. When you love knowledge enough to let it humble you, that is illumination. He did not walk away from Baghdad to escape people. He walked away to meet himself before God. And when he returned, he brought a secret the world still tries to remember. The heart is not found, it is uncovered. Like treasure already buried within, waiting for the courage to dig. Each time a person pauses in the middle of achievement and wonders, why am I still empty? Each time someone prays after years of silence and feels their chest soften. Each time reason admits wonder instead of resisting it. That is Al-Ghazali living again. That is the mind finding the heart. He once said that the proof of a scholar's sincerity is that his students need not remember his name. If so, then his sincerity is complete. For billions live by lessons whose author they have forgotten. But perhaps that was his wish all along, to vanish, so that only the light he loved would remain. And if that light still guides us, then his walk away from Baghdad was never departure. It was return. Night again. A quiet wind passes over Tus, brushing the pomegranate leaves above the grave where the scholar sleeps. The stars shine with the same patient light that once watched him write beneath his lamp. The ink has faded. The paper has turned to dust, but the truth he found lives, not in libraries, but in souls. It begins wherever a heart breaks open and lets light in. He began as a boy hungry for knowledge. He became a man intoxicated by fame. He broke as a soul, crushed by its own brilliance. And he was reborn as a servant, who finally understood that God does not ask for perfection, only presence. He proved that the path to divine certainty runs through human doubt, and that sincerity is the only bridge that survives time. He taught the world that thinking is worship, but only when guided by humility. And that silence, when filled with remembrance, is louder than 1,000 lectures. Centuries later, his story still whispers across the ages, do not mistake motion for meaning. Do not confuse applause for acceptance. Walk away from everything that dims your heart, and God will walk toward you. That was his secret. That was his legacy. Not a philosophy to memorize, but a mirror to face. And in that mirror, we see our own reflection, our own restlessness, our own longing, our own divine appointment with stillness. Al-Ghazali's life teaches us that truth often hides behind loss, and that sometimes God strips us of comfort not to punish us, but to prepare us for clarity. He reminds us that doubt is not the enemy of faith. It is the doorway through which the sincere must pass. He shows that intellect and love are not rivals, but reflections of each other, and that the heart, when cleansed of pride, becomes the scholar's truest book. His walk away from Baghdad was not an escape. It was a return to purpose. And in that return lies the question that never ages. When knowledge becomes status, will we have the courage to choose sincerity instead? When success blinds us, will we remember to see with the heart again? And so, tonight, as our fire burns low and the world outside grows quiet, remember this. The man who once silenced empires with logic found peace only when he silenced himself before God. He did not abandon the world. He healed it by healing his own soul first. Perhaps that is why his story still feels personal. Because somewhere inside each of us lives a scholar debating, a seeker trembling, and a heart waiting to be found. Good evening, dear listener, and thank you for sitting once more by the fire. May the peace that found Imam Al-Ghazali find you too, and may every argument you win with your mind end, at last, in the quiet victory of the heart. If this story touched your heart, share it with the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.